She was barely a bride, still in the bloom of her youth. But just as she found out she was expecting, her husband passed away in a tragic accident. There she was, grieving alone at the spot where she'd lost him, when out of nowhere, a stranger came up behind her and asked her to marry him. She was still drowning in the pain of losing her husband, and couldn't even begin to imagine letting a complete stranger into her life. But Clark didn't back off just because she kept her distance. He laid it out for her. If they tied the knot, it just might solve both their problems. Turns out Clark had lost his wife a few years back. He'd been raising their daughter all on his own, and without a mother figure in her life. The girl had turned fiercely rebellious, and had built up a wall of resentment against just about everyone and everything around her. Hoping to give his daughter a shot at a normal upbringing, Clark had started thinking about finding her a stepmother. And with Marty stranded and desperate at that very moment, he'd mustered the courage to propose. In exchange, he could offer her shelter through the winter. And he threw in one more tempting promise. Come spring, he'd give her enough money to head back home. Just days earlier, Marty had arrived here with her husband, full of dreams, planning to build a home of their very own. But fate had other plans. A cruel, twisted joke. When her husband fell from his horse and died while chasing after a stray, not a single beam had been raised for their house, and now the man she loved was buried in the cold, hard ground. The baby growing in her belly, still too small to show, was the only piece of him she had left. She'd not only lost her husband, but the horse pulling her wagon had run off too, and home was over 1,000 miles away. She was well and truly stranded in this strange, unforgiving land. For a woman with nothing to her name, this was about as good an offer as she was going to get. So in the end, she said yes to Clark. She went back home with him. But before the wagon even came to a full stop, Missie jumped off and bolted, making it crystal clear she wanted nothing to do with this new mother. Marty just stood there frozen, not having a clue how to handle this stranger and his daughter. Thankfully, Clark was nothing but respectful toward Marty. He gave her and Missie the only warm, sunlit room in the house, and moved himself out to the barn to sleep. Marty walked into the room without saying a word, closed the door, and shut the whole world out. Then she curled up in the corner, staring at her late husband's photo, as grief came crashing down on her all over again. She felt like she'd betrayed the man she still loved with all her heart. The next morning, Marty didn't wake up until almost noon. Clark had thoughtfully left her breakfast. He told her he was heading to town with his daughter to get some supplies and wouldn't be back till late. As they pulled out, he made a point of clattering the wagon loudly so she'd hear them drive off. It was his own clumsy, sweet way of giving her space to let out whatever she needed to let out, all alone. First thing the next morning, Marty woke to the sound of hooves. Clark had already returned from town, and he'd brought back everything she'd left behind on the wagon, including the books she treasured more than anything. Looking at her things, her familiar belongings, she felt a storm of emotions swirl inside her. She finally asked Clark straight up what exactly he expected her to do. But instead of answering directly, he nodded toward his daughter, struggling with heavy farm chores in the distance, and said, she'd been doing that for years now, never complaining once, but all that work was stealing her childhood away from her. He said if someone could just lighten the load a little at home, she'd have time to learn the kinds of things he figured Marty could teach her. His words really hit her. She looked at that small, tired figure and found herself lost in thought. So, to give Missie a shot at learning, and to repay Clark for taking her in, she decided to give farm work a try. That evening, Clark hadn't made it home yet, so Marty took it upon herself to cook dinner. But with zero cooking experience, she was a total mess. She burned the pancakes and burned her hand while she was at it. Just then, Clark walked in. He spotted her injury right away and got to work treating it with butter, so careful and gentle. Even Missie came over and handed her the medicine. Maybe even Missie didn't quite get it herself. It wasn't that she truly hated Marty. She just couldn't stand the thought of anyone taking her mother's place. One day, while Marty was out for a walk, she accidentally stumbled upon a scene that broke her heart. Missie had laid out her late mother's favorite red dress on the bed, so carefully, then pulled open the curtains to let sunlight fall across it. She was murmuring to the dress, pouring her heart out with all the longing a child could have for her mom. Watching from just outside the door, Marty couldn't hold back her tears. Her sob gave her away, and Missie spun around, accusing her of spying, and lashed out in anger. I don't want you here. I wish it were spring already so you could just get out. Then she ran off in tears, leaving Marty rooted to the spot, alone with her thoughts. She started to wonder, more than ever, if she ever belonged here at all. And Clark, having just come back, had seen the whole thing. Later, Marty began packing her things, determined to leave early. But Clark found her, and spoke to her in that steady, heartfelt way of his, telling her that Missie needed her help, and that it would take time for her daughter to warm up to her, just like it would take time for her to warm up to Missie. He encouraged her to give them all a little more time, and said he truly believed she'd find a way to reach his daughter. His words calmed her down. Then, eyeing the red dress that meant so much to Missie, A bold idea sparked in her mind. She grabbed her scissors and, without a second thought, cut into one of her own red dresses, tailoring it down to fit Missie's small frame. By the dim glow of the fireplace, like a real mother would, she stitched through the night, making a tiny red dress just for her. The next morning, Missy walked out of her room and spotted the beautiful little dress waiting for her on a chair, and Marty, exhausted, dozing nearby after staying up all night. But Marty woke at the sound of her and held the dress up against Missy to see how it fit. And for the first time, a real smile spread across Missy's face. Right then, the ice between them finally cracked. Soon after, Missy wore that new red dress into town, and all the other kids couldn't help but stare with envy. On the ride home, she leaned against Marty's shoulder, tired and peaceful, and fell fast asleep. Then a bump in the road made Marty wince. She grabbed her belly out of instinct. Clark caught the little gesture. One day he asked her, softly, when she was due. Marty was shocked, so he'd known she was pregnant all along. She figured he'd think less of her for it. But instead, he said something that caught her completely off guard. "I'm glad you're having his baby. It's a way to remember him." Those words hit her like a warm wave, right to her chest. She couldn't help the smile that crept onto her face, and maybe she didn't even realize it herself. But her feelings for this quiet, decent man had already begun to shift. In the weeks that followed, with Marty's patient guidance, Missy fell in love with reading and writing, and the house slowly filled with a warmth it hadn't known in a long time. Then one day, Marty spotted something that made her heart leap, the horse she'd lost months ago. She chased after it, thrilled, but out of nowhere, snow started to fall. And within minutes, it had turned into a full-blown blizzard. When Clark got home and found Marty missing, panic hit him like a punch to the gut. He grabbed his gun and handed it to his daughter, telling her to fire it into the air if he wasn't back in 10 minutes. Then he charged out into the blinding storm. But the snow was so thick, he could barely see a thing. He just kept shouting her name over and over. Miraculously, he found her, unconscious and nearly frozen. By then, though, he'd lost his bearings too. Back at home, Missy saw the time was up. She started firing into the sky. The gunshots gave Clark a vague sense of direction, but soon the bullets ran out, and the shots stopped. Quick thinking, Missy didn't miss a beat. She ran into the kitchen, grabbed a pot and a spoon, and banged on it with everything she had at the front door. The sharp, ringing clang cut through the wind and snow, guiding Clark toward home. When she saw her father's silhouette appear in the doorway, Missy was already in tears. She'd come so close to losing the two most important people in her life in one fell swoop. Clark got Marty inside and settled, half frozen, then stayed by her bedside the whole night through. He didn't let out the breath he'd been holding until she opened her eyes the next morning. As the snow began to melt, Marty's first Christmas in this new home drew near. Over dinner, Missy asked her, so innocently, if her daddy had ever told her Christmas stories. Marty paused, then said her father passed away when she was very young. Missy asked about her mother too. Marty told her she'd lost her a long time ago too. So Missy asked Marty who she'd spend Christmas with when she went home. That question hit hard. The home she'd been so set on returning to, there was no one there waiting for her anymore. Clark quickly stepped in and smoothed things over, saying that the meaning of Christmas was about spending it with the people you care about. Watching this tall, strong man with such a tender heart, Marty felt a sense of peace she'd never known before. When Christmas Day finally came, Clark, keeping to the city tradition, brought in a Christmas tree and decorated the house, and gave Missy a little wooden Christmas cottage as a present. What touched Marty even more was the crib he'd built himself, a beautifully carved little bed for her unborn child. That gift meant more to a soon-to-be mother than words could ever say. That night, watching Clark tell Missy a Christmas story in the glow of the fire, Marty felt like she was floating in a dream. Everything was so warm and yet so unreal. The days rolled by, and Marty's belly grew bigger and bigger. Then one day, sharp pain struck out of the blue. It was time. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there was no time to fetch a midwife. Clark had helped deliver calves before, and he just gritted his teeth and took charge. After a tense, frantic rush, a new cry pierced the air. A baby, healthy and strong, had arrived. Missy stood there, watching the happiness fill that room, and her eyes grew misty without her even noticing. One day, Marty and Clark were out in the fields, planting. Playfully, she shoved him from behind, sending him tumbling to the ground, then took off laughing. He chased after her, and the two of them wrestled and laughed like kids out in the open field. Just days before Marty was set to leave, tragedy struck again. The barn caught fire without a moment's warning. Clark dashed in without thinking, risking his life to save what he could, while Marty stood outside, her heart in her throat, praying nonstop, until she saw him stagger back out through the flames. Only then could she breathe again. The fire consumed just about everything in that barn, including Marty's wagon, the very one she'd planned to use for her journey home. And still, Clark stood by his word. He promised he'd find a way, get her what she needed, and see her home, just as he'd said a year ago. His voice carried a heavy sadness he couldn't quite hide. But Marty just kept her head down and tended to his wounds, pretending not to hear. Later, Marty went up to the hilltop all alone. She closed her eyes, and the last few months played out like a movie in her mind. The grief and resistance at the start, the slow thaw, the growing warmth, and now this attachment, this ache at the thought of leaving. This man and his daughter had given her something she'd never really had, a home, and that feeling made her fall deeply for this place, and for these two strangers who had wandered into her life. So she made up her mind. Back home, she sat down and wrote a letter. It said, "Dear Clark, the wagon train is about to leave. But I don't want to go, so ask me to stay. Love, Marty." Then she tucked the letter carefully into the book he kept by his bed, the one he read every night. She was full of hope, sure that once he found it, he'd beg her to stay. But fate had one last cruel twist in store. Missie, while tidying up, accidentally knocked that same book off the nightstand. And when she picked it up off the floor, the letter slipped out and landed right under the bed. So Marty waited and waited, but Clark never asked her to stay. She took that to mean he didn't truly want her there. Heartbroken, she told him she'd be leaving with the next wagon train. Clark, though torn apart inside, simply nodded and respected her choice. Through the window, Marty could see Missie crying her eyes out over the news that she was leaving, and it twisted her own heart just as badly. But the day of parting came, whether she liked it or not. Waiting for the wagon, Missie turned her back on both of them and refused to say a word. When Marty bent down and gently turned her around, she saw the little girl's face streaked with tears. Missie threw her arms around Marty in a tight, desperate hug. Then, with the two of them watching from a distance, Marty's wagon rolled away, getting smaller and smaller. Back in that hollow, quiet house, an emptiness settled over both of them that words couldn't touch. Clark went to his room alone, and the grief he'd held in for so long finally broke free. Just as the tears took over, his eyes fell on something under the bed, that letter. He snatched it up and opened it, and the words hit him like a thunderbolt. She never wanted to leave at all. He didn't waste another second. He mounted his horse and tore off in the direction Marty had gone. To catch the caravan before it disappeared, he cut across the wide-open prairie. The horse thundered over the plains in the golden dusk, carrying everything this man loved and hoped for. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he caught up. He shouted her name at the top of his lungs, and Marty's head shot out of the wagon at the sound of that familiar voice. It was him, the man she'd been longing for. Clark cleared up the misunderstanding and asked her to stay. They finally laid their cards on the table and admitted what they both knew. They loved each other. Then Clark led her right back through that familiar door. And Missie, without missing a beat, spoke the two words that changed everything. Mom. And so this story, which began with so much sorrow, but found its way to joy through love and grace, came to the warmest, most tender ending imaginable. Life was never meant to be a smooth ride. Out of nowhere, storms will come and shatter the plans we held so dear. Just like Marty losing her husband and Missie losing her mother. Those wounds trapped them in the darkness for a long time and made them believe the light would never find them again. But love always finds a way. It showed up in Clark's awkward, wholehearted care, and in every stitch Marty sewed into that little red dress for Missie, and in the quiet, everyday moments of patience and warmth they gave each other. Love isn't always some grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes it's just a hand reaching out when you're stuck, a hug that says it'll be okay when you're at your lowest, and the little kindnesses that slowly weave themselves into your life. Sometimes we have to say goodbye before we can say hello again, and the deepest hurts have a way of healing with time and love. May we all find someone in the coldest winters of our lives who's willing to wait for spring with us, and may we also be that light for someone else, turning loneliness into togetherness and turning life's regrets into something warm.